Hello, everyone. This is the Diary of Anne Frank, Act 1, Scene 3. Just a little bit of a recap. Anne and the Von Don family have just recently moved into the secret annex in order to have a safe place to hide from the Nazis. They are getting acquainted, getting to know each other a little bit more. Within scene 3, you should be focusing on character traits and any conflicts that we see arise. So we all know once we get to know one another a little bit more, we start to have more conflicts with people, right? So here we go with scene 3. It is a little after 6 o'clock in the evening, 2 months later. Margot is in the bedroom at the right, studying. Mr. Von Don is lying down in the attic room above. The rest of the family is in the main room. Anne and Peter sit opposite each other at the center table, where they have been doing their lessons. Mrs. Frank is on the couch, and Mrs. Von Don is seated with her fur coat, on which she has been sewing, in her lap. None of them are wearing their shoes. Their eyes are on Mr. Frank, waiting for him to give them the signal which will release them from their day-long quiet. Mr. Frank, his shoes in his hand, stands looking down out of the window at the back, watching to be sure that all of the workmen have left the building below. After a few seconds of motionless silence, Mr. Frank turns from the window. "It's safe now. The last workman has left." "Whee! Anne! I'm first for the WC." Mrs. Von Don hurries off to the bathroom, and Mrs. Frank puts on her shoes and starts up to the sink to prepare dinner. Anne sneaks Peter's shoes from under the table and hides them behind her back. Mr. Frank goes into Margot's room. 6 o'clock. School's over." "Have you seen my shoes?" "Your shoes? You've taken them, haven't you?" "I don't know what you're talking about." "You're going to be sorry." "Am I?" Peter goes after Anne, and Anne, with his shoes in her hand, runs from him, dodging behind her mother. "Anne, dear." "Wait till I get you." "I'm waiting." Peter makes a lunge for her, and they both fall to the floor. Peter pins her down, wrestling her to get the shoes. Don't, Peter, stop it. Ouch!" "Anne! Peter!" Peter, where are you going? Come dance with me." "I tell you, I don't know how." "I'll teach you." "I'm going to give Mooshy his dinner." "Can I watch?" "He doesn't like people around while he eats." "Peter, please." "No." He goes into his room, and Anne slams his door after him. "Anne, dear, I think you shouldn't play like that with Peter. It's not dignified." "Who cares if it's dignified? I don't want to be dignified." Mr. Frank and Margot come from the room on the right, and Margot goes to help her mother. Mr. Frank starts for the center table to correct Margot's school papers. Mrs. Frank says to Anne, "You complain that I don't treat you like a grown-up, but when I do, you resent it." "I only want some fun, someone to laugh and clown with. After you've sat all day and hardly move, you've got to have some fun. I don't know what's the matter with that boy." "He isn't used to girls. Give him a little time." "Time? Isn't 2 months time? I could cry. Come on, Margot, dance with me. Come on, please." "I have to help with supper." "You know we're going to forget how to dance. When we get out, we won't remember a thing." She starts to sing and dance by herself, and Mr. Frank takes her in his arms, waltzing with her. Mrs. Von Don comes in from the bathroom. "Next? Where's Peter?" Where would he be?" "He hasn't finished his lessons, has he? His father'll kill him if he catches him in there with that cat and his work not done. Anne, get him out of there, will you?" "Peter! Peter!" "What is it?" "Your mother says to come out." "I'm giving Mooshy his dinner." "You know what your father says." "For heaven's sake, I haven't even looked at him since lunch." "I'm just telling you. That's all." "I'll feed him." "I don't want you in there." "Peter!" "Then give him his dinner and come right out. You hear?" He comes back to the table, and Anne shuts the door of Peter's room after her and disappears behind the curtain covering his closet. Mrs. Von Don says to Peter, "Now, is that any way to talk to your little girlfriend?" Mother, for heaven's sake, will you please stop saying that? Look at him blush. Look at him. Please, I'm not. Anyway, leave me alone, will you? He acts like it's something to be ashamed of. It's nothing to be ashamed of to have a little girlfriend. You're crazy. She's only 13. So what? And you're 16. Just perfect. Your father's 10 years older than I am. I warn you, Mr. Frank, if this war lasts much longer, we're going to be related. And then, Mazel Tov! I wonder where Meep is. She's usually so prompt. Okay, so let's pause really quickly here just to chat for a moment. So we can see here that obviously Mrs. Von Don is almost kind of encouraging a relationship between Peter and Anne. She thinks it's very cute that they are, kind of showing an interest. Anne definitely is showing an interest into Peter. Peter, however, is denying it, right? And we learn here that Peter and Anne are 3 years apart. So Peter is 16 and Anne is only 13 at this time, okay? All right. Suddenly, everything else is forgotten as they hear the sound of an automobile coming to a screeching stop in the street below. They are tense, motionless in their terror. The car starts away. A wave of relief sweeps over them. They pick up their occupations again. Anne flings open the door of Peter's room, making a dramatic entrance. She is dressed in Peter's clothes. Peter looks at her in fury. The others are amused. "Good evening, everyone. Forgive me if I don't stay. I have a friend waiting for me in there. My friend Tom. Tomcat. Some people say that we look alike, but Tom has the most beautiful whiskers, and I have only a little fuzz. I am hoping in time." "All right, Mrs. Quack Quack." "Peter, I heard about you, how you talked so much in class they called you Mrs. Quack Quack, how Mr. Smitter made you write a composition." "Quack, quack," said Mrs. Quack Quack. "Well, go on. Tell them the rest, how it was so good he read it out loud to the class and then read it to all of his other classes." "Quack, quack, 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 quack." Anne pulls off the coat and trousers. "You are the most intolerable, insufferable boy I've ever met." She throws the clothes down the stairwell, and Peter goes down after them. "Quack, quack, quack." "That's right, Annika, give it to him." "With all the boys in the world, why had I to get locked up with one like you? Quack, 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 and from now on, stay out of my room." As Peter passes her, Anne puts out her foot, tripping him. He picks himself up and goes on into his room. "Anne, dear, your hair. You're warm. Are you feeling all right?" "Please, Mother." She goes over to the center table, slipping it into her shoes. "You haven't a fever, have you?" "No, no. You know we can't call a doctor here, ever. There's only one thing to do. Watch carefully. Prevent an illness before it comes. Let me see your tongue." "Mother, this is perfectly absurd." "Anne, dear, don't be such a baby. Let me see your tongue." As Anne refuses, Mrs. Frank appeals to Mr. Frank. "Otto, you hear your mother, Anne." Anne flicks her tongue out for a second and then turns away. "Come on, open up." As Anne opens her mouth very wide. "You seem all right, but perhaps an aspirin." "For heaven's sake, don't give that child any pills. I waited for 15 minutes this morning for her to come out of the WC. "I was washing my hair." "I think there's nothing the matter with our Anne that a ride on her bike or a visit with her friend Yopi de Wall couldn't cure. Isn't that so, Anne?" Okay, so what's happening here is that Mrs. Von Don is basically accusing Anne of being over hyper, okay? She says, don't give her any pills. She's already taking forever to do anything. She's constantly, running around, doing this, doing that, extremely talkative. And Mr. Frank says, listen, Mrs. Von Don, what's wrong with my daughter? She doesn't need an aspirin. All she needs is a ride on her bike. She needs her life to be normal. Okay. Also, this is important to remember here that Mrs. Frank is incredibly concerned with everyone's health because we can't call any doctors. They can't go to a hospital if something happens. And so it's very important that they, pay close attention to their health, to staying healthy in order to avoid getting caught. Mr. Von Don comes down. Oh, sorry about that. Mr. Von Don comes down into the room, and from outside we hear faint sounds of bombers going over and a burst of ack. Meep not come yet? The workman just left a little while ago. What's for dinner tonight? Beans. Not again. Poor Pooty. I know, but what can we do? That's all that Meep has brought us. Mr. Von Don starts to pace, his hands behind his back, and Anne follows behind him, imitating him. We are now in what is known as the bean cycle. Beans boiled, beans in casserole, beans with strings, beans without strings. Peter has come out of his room and he slides into his place at the table, becoming immediately absorbed in his studies. I saw you in there playing with your cat. He just went in for a second, putting his coat away. He's been out there all the time doing his lessons. Anne, you got an excellent in your history paper today, and very good in Latin. How about algebra? I'll have to make up a confession. Up until now, I've managed to stay ahead of you in algebra. Today, you caught up with me. We'll have to leave it to Margot to correct. Isn't algebra vile, Pem? Vile. Okay, so here we should be able to use context clues in order to determine the meaning of the word vile. Okay, so it's very clear that she doesn't like algebra, right? So vile is to be disgusting or repulsive. For example, the smell of the food was so vile we didn't dare to taste it. Margot asks her father, Mr. Frank, how did I do? Excellent, 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 excellent. Mr. Frank says to Margot, you should have used the subjunctive here. Should I? I thought, look here, I didn't use it here. Mrs. Von Don, may I try on your coat? No, Anne. Oh, it's all right, but be careful with it. My father gave me that the year before he died. He always bought the best that money could buy. Mrs. Von Don, did you have a lot of boyfriends before you were married? Anne, that's a personal question. It's not courteous to ask personal questions. Oh, I don't mind. Our house was always swarming with boys. When I was a girl, we had... Oh, God, not again. Shut up! One summer, we had a big house in Hilversum. The boys came buzzing round like bees around a jam pot, and when I was 16, we were wearing our skirts very short those days, and I had good-looking legs. Mrs. Von Don pulls up her skirt, going to Mr. Frank. I still have 'em. I may not be as pretty as I used to be, but I still have my legs. How about it, Mr. Frank? All right, we see them. I'm not asking you. I'm asking Mr. Frank. Mother, for heaven's sake. Okay, so right here we see how Mrs. Von Don is clearly flirting with Mr. Frank. She's wanting Mr. Frank to check out her legs, okay? Clearly this is very, very embarrassing to Peter. And to go back, Anne has now asked Mrs. Von Don to wear her fur coat. Now we know that fur coats are very expensive, and this fur coat means a lot to Mrs. Von Don because her father has bought it for her. So if something were to happen to this coat, this could cause a major conflict. This is definitely an example of foreshadowing. All right, so Peter is embarrassed of his mother and says, Mother, for heaven's sake. Oh, I embarrass you, do I? Well, I just hope the girl you marry has as good... My father used to worry about me with so many boys hanging around. He told me if any of them get it's fresh, you say to him, "Remember, Mr. So-and-so, remember I'm a lady." Remember, Mr. So-and-so, remember I'm a lady. Anne gives Mrs. Von Don her coat. Look at you talking that way in front of her. Don't you know she puts that all down in that diary? So if she does, I'm only telling the truth. Anne stretches out, putting her ear to the floor, listening to what is going on below. The sound of the bombers fades away. Would you mind, Peter, if I moved you over to the couch? Miep must have the radio on. Peter picks up his papers and going over to the couch beside Mrs. Von Don. Mr. Von Don says to Peter, "Haven't you finished yet?" "No." "You ought to be ashamed of yourself." All right. I'm a dunce. I'm a hopeless case. Why do I go on?" "Oh, you are not hopeless. Don't talk that way. It's just that you haven't anyone to help you like the girls have. Maybe you could help him, Mr. Frank." "I'm sure that his father—" "Not me. I can't do anything with him. He won't listen to me. You go ahead if you want." "What about it, Peter? Shall we make our school coeducational?" "You're an angel, Mr. Frank, an angel. I don't know why I didn't meet you before I met that one there. Here, sit down, Mr. Frank. Now, Peter, you listen to Mr. Frank." Okay, so again, another dig here from Mrs. Von Don to her husband. She says, "I don't know why I didn't meet Mr. Frank before I met my husband, Mr. Von Don." Okay. Again, she's continuing to flirt, and now they've just decided that Mr. Frank will also help to teach and educate Peter as well, because Mr. Von Don says that Peter doesn't listen to him. "It might be better for us to go into Peter's room." Peter jumps up eagerly, leading the way. "That's right. You go in there, Peter. You listen to Mr. Frank. Mr. Frank is a highly educated man." As Mr. Frank is about to follow Peter into his room, Mrs. Frank stops him and wipes the lipstick from his lips. Then she closes the door after him. "Shh! I can hear a man's voice talking." "Isn't it bad enough without your sprawling all over the place?" Mrs. Von Don says to her husband, "If you didn't smoke so much, you wouldn't be so bad-tempered." "Am I smoking? Do you see me smoking?" "Don't tell me you've used up all those cigarettes." "One package? Miep only brought me one package." "It's a filthy habit anyway. It's a good time to break yourself." "Oh, stop it, please." "You're smoking up all our money. You know that, don't you?" "Will you shut up?" During this, Mrs. Frank and Margot have studiously kept their eyes down, but Anne, seated on the floor, has been following the discussion interestedly. Mr. Von Don turns to see her staring up at him. "And what are you staring at?" "I never heard grown-ups quarrel before. I thought only children quarreled." Okay. So right here, quarrel obviously means a fight or an argument. So the fact that Anne says, "I never heard grown-ups quarrel before," what does that tell us about her parents? I've never heard grown-ups fight or argue before. This shows us that Mr. and Mrs. Frank have a very good relationship. If they ever do argue, they make sure not to do it in front of their children. She says she's never even seen grown-ups argue, ever, okay? "This isn't a quarrel, it's a discussion, and I never heard children so rude before." All right, so Anne says, "I rude? Yes." "Anne, will you get me my knitting? I must remember when Miep comes to ask her to bring me some more wool."